If it hadn't have been for COVID and the snow, I would have been getting on a plane and going to Palma de Mallorca. I'm still going to Zoom for them, and I'm rather worried about it because, believe it or not, they've actually asked me to do Antonio Gaudí. So I feel like I'm putting my head in the proverbial lion's mouth, because I feel that they probably should have somebody expert in that subject on the island already, but apparently not. And the reason I'm mentioning this is, of course, that Mackintosh was part of something much bigger, known internationally as Art Nouveau, if you're in a French-speaking area, Jugendstil, if you're in a German-speaking area or Scandinavia. And if you're lucky enough to have been to Vienna or to Budapest, you'll know that it's known as Secession. A lot of people ask me, why did it happen in Scotland, or more specifically in Glasgow, rather than in London? Because we don't really have a proper new art movement. That's the English, of course, name for it. We don't really have a strong new art movement in London. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the natural leader of the new art movement had recently gone to prison. His name was Oscar Wilde. And there was no doubt that the new art was tainted in many people's eyes because of dear Oscar's activities, or should I say, proclivities. So it is to Scotland that we have to go, and to Edinburgh in particular, for what was essentially an artistic revolution in terms of modern art and design. And the other reason perhaps that London got left behind was that we were entrenched in the William Morris arts and crafts movements. Although you can't see it, I'm wearing a William Morris shirt. So without further ado, I should say, here are Mackintosh and the Glasgow Four. We do tend to forget the other four, but originally there were four in the group. You're going to meet them all this morning. So Charles Lee Mackintosh, you'll have noticed from his birth date that we were celebrating 150 years of his birthday quite recently, 2018, and that was when the School of Art was supposed to reopen. It originally burnt down in 2014, but I have no idea what's going to happen to it now, and I'm not going to linger over it because, quite frankly, like most people, I'm still heartbroken that A, it happened in the first place, and how it ever happened a second time is, quite frankly, beyond me. For those of you who are a little clued in, that birth date is also very significant because it puts him in the same generation as Frank Lloyd Wright, who was born, in fact, either 1 year before or 1 year after. Frank Lloyd Wright often lied about his age. He was very vain. And it also puts him in the same generation as Edwin Lutyens, who, of course, again, might give you a good idea of why Mackintosh wasn't so successful south of the border. And then his wife was, in fact, as you can see, a little older. Yes, she was born in 64, but she outlives Mackintosh. And we'll talk about their sad decline really in the 1920s, and they will retreat to Collioure in the south of France, but more of that later. I've started off, in fact, with two photographs of them, obviously Mackintosh at the top and Margaret down the bottom. She didn't walk around like that on a permanent basis, by the way. That just happens to be fancy dress that she is captured in. And I've often thought she looks a little bit like Brunhilde with those plaits. And then I've got two of his iconic chairs, because although his career is meteoric and inevitably rather short, he leaves Glasgow in 1914, never to return, you can see the very obvious evolution in his style, from the Argyle Street chair, which is pure Art Nouveau in its interlocking curves and straight lines, and then the chair for Hill House, or certainly used at Hill House, which is 1902. So there's only a few years between them. The chair is 97/98. That's the this one here. I'll put my cursor over it, with the long back and the ellipse with the bird flying through it. So that's what that is, by the way. So that's 1897-98, and the chair for Hill House is 1902. So you can see a remarkably quick evolution of his style, and I'll explain again why that happens as our story unfolds. So here we are in Glasgow. So of course it was second city of the empire, not just second city of Scotland. It was a massive port, incredibly wealthy, but also incredibly dirty, as you can see from my two images here, showing you the sort of cut and thrust of Edinburgh at the turn of the century. I do love all those horse-drawn trolley buses and just the general hubbub, as you can see. And of course, Edinburgh was the capital of the north, or the Athens even of the north. And there was fierce rivalry, hasn't changed that much, has it really, between Glasgow and Edinburgh. So Edinburgh was the sort of centre of culture. It had all the institutions in terms of its academies, and Glasgow was the young, bumptious upstart. However, of course, it was where the money was. And it was really at the end of the 1880s that Glasgow put itself on the map with its first international exhibition. For those of you who are familiar with Glasgow, you might know Kelvin Grove, which is the magnificent art gallery in the city centre. You might think that this is a painting of Kelvin Grove. And in fact, Kelvin Grove doesn't look a lot dissimilar, but this is a temporary building put up for the international exhibition. And it's painted here by one of the so-called Glasgow boys, John Lavery, who is very influenced by French Impressionism and James McNeill Whistler, as you can see in the image. But it was with the international exhibition at the end of the 1880s that Glasgow really put itself on the map. So it had advantages over Edinburgh. It wasn't so stuck in the mud. It was young, it was progressive. Yes, it was noisy and it was dirty, but there was a real sense of modernity in Glasgow compared to 18th century Edinburgh. So I mentioned that we have to put Mackintosh into a broader context. So it's very hard when I show you two images like this one. This is Victor Horta's L'Hôtel Tassel. That's just a posh house, by the way, in Brussels. First Art Nouveau house in Europe. And I try now very hard to use the terms as they should be, i.e. Art Nouveau for anywhere, French, Belgian, anywhere in the French-speaking world. I tried to use the words Art Nouveau. If I'm in a German-speaking area, I try to use Jugendstil. The trouble is that Art Nouveau has become a bit of a blanket term, and you'll often read that Mackintosh didn't like Art Nouveau. By that, he meant he didn't like French Art Nouveau, because in fact, he was very much part, in many ways, of what was going on in Germany and in Austria, as you'll see. So French Art Nouveau is very distinctive. It's a mass of curvy linear ornament. It was often referred to as the decorative disease. The curvy linear whiplash Horta element. Horta was famous for what's known as the coupe de fouet, or the whiplash curve. And as you can see, it goes up the floor, well, along the floor, up the wall, and even over the ceiling. So it's a bit like living in a giant hot house, which is in fact the intention, because you're looking here at an extension of the interior garden room of the Horta house. By comparison, Mackintosh's style is quite different, isn't it? Don't be confused by this. Art Nouveau, the reason I spent my entire life studying it, is all the architects and designers associated with it are very individualistic. So Mackintosh's fellows include people like, as I've already mentioned, Gaudi in Barcelona. And then obviously when we go to Paris, it's Hector Guimard, Victor Horta in Brussels. If we go over to Darmstadt, it's a chap called Josef Maria Albrecht, who was very active in Vienna alongside Otto Wagner. And the thing to remember that this is not like Art Deco or modernism, which comes after the First World War. All the architects involved with the new art pursued an individualistic style or ethos. So that's why Mackintosh looks so different, but nevertheless, he's part of this international movement. In fact, it's often referred to as international and national in the same breath. We'll come back to that cabinet later. It's actually made from Mackintosh's own home, as we'll see. So the important thing to remember about Art Nouveau was it wasn't just about architecture and interior design. It embraced all aspects of the arts. We can talk about symbolism in painting, and we can talk about decadence in literature. Even fashion. sort of was swept up in the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is what all these architects followed. The concept that a building should be a total work of art, which means a coordination of every single aspect, right the way down to, you know, what you might use on the table, and most importantly, your wife had to be coordinated to the Gesamtkunstwerk. She too had to be artistic. There was art in front of everything, so everything becomes art, and everybody's an artist, as everybody's supposed to create a beautiful interior in which to live and work in. In fact, the whole point of a home was to be a place of solace and respite after the work, a place, you know, sort of oasis away from the hustle and bustle of modern life. It was to be a palace of art, a house beautiful. So this is Madame Vandervelde. The two drawings, or I should say their watercolours on the wall, are by her husband, Henri Vandervelde, one of the most important Belgian Art Nouveau designers, and her dress has been made to match. The only problem now is that Madame Vandervelde might have difficulty leaving her drawing room. She's been harmonised, coordinated to the point that she's rather trapped in it. Madame Vandervelde here is at the mercy of her husband, but Margaret, who has flashed up over the cabinet behind, was in fact orchestrated her own look. She designed and made her own clothes, and her contribution to the cabinet behind is the beaten panel on the front. Though, as I said, you know, working out which part of the project was Mackintosh and which part was Margaret is often a little difficult because they worked in a very, very similar style, but essentially they were collaborators. And Margaret's contribution was often the metalwork on a cabinet. So particularly the metalwork that you see here, a beaten pewter panel or a gesso or gesso panel. We'll see some more of those later. So whereas Madame Vandervelde was a bit of a victim, you could say, to Art Nouveau, Margaret was not. She saw herself very much as a new woman, a pioneer of a new role for women within the artistic establishments. And the rise of women in art was largely down to the schools of art, like the one she attended, the Glasgow School of Art. So here is your classic piece of Mackintosh furniture. Designed for Hill House. It was actually retrieved. It was bought somewhere around about 2001, 2002, and it was jointly bought, in fact, by Kelvin Grove and the Fine Arts Society. And I'm not sure that that's the original down the bottom then. It may well be a reproduction, but the important thing is you can see there what it was supposed to look like. That's actually it in situ at Hill House, surrounded by stencil decoration, matching lamps and chairs, just to remind you that Mackintosh was very much ruled by the Gesamtkunstwerk. And the panel in this case, in the centre, which uses mother of pearl and aluminium, has always been attributed to Mackintosh. Now, it's known as a kimono cabinet because it looks like a woman in a kimono with her arms outstretched. I also want you to note the square, that the grid pattern running around the doors, as that's going to become a signature of the Glasgow Four. So the passion for Japan is one of the ways in which we can identify Mackintosh's difference. And this is to remind you that they had been obsessed with Japan for most of the 19th century, ever since Japan was opened up to the West in the early 1850s. So this is Madame Monet. If you've ever been to Giverny, you'll know that Monet avidly collected Japanese prints, and this dates to the early 1870s. Madame Monet is actually in a Chinese robe, but it does the job for my, reminding you of the importance of Japanism, which blended Chinese and Japanese elements together. But what is very obviously Japanese are all the paper fans that you see on the wall behind her. And by the 1870s, E.W. Godwin, one of England's most advanced architects, was designing what we lovingly refer to as Anglo-Japanese furniture of this ilk. So this is in the V&A. And you can see that again, it's very much inspired by a kimono in the way that the arms go out to either side. And the idea would be that you covered this with progressive metalwork and ceramics and glass by Christopher Dresser. So it's very important that you understand the impacts of Japan in Glasgow in particular. I've mentioned the Glasgow boys. They're like a precursor to Mackintosh and the Four, because the Glasgow boys are active in the preceding decade. Henry and Ulysses Atkinson Hornell and George Henry, they go off to Tokyo to paint in 1893. And you can see that in the portrait of Hornell at the top, which is by Bessie Newbury, you can see there's a rather lovely Japanese screen. And then I'm showing you two examples of their work. The one that looks like Van Gogh painted it, which is this one here, Kite Flying. That's by Atkinson Hornell. And then I love the one of the Japanese lady with a fan, because it looks like it's almost like a palette that the colours have been laid out on her fan. So Mackintosh would have been very familiar with Japanese art, and even more amusingly, the Japanese Navy was being built on the Clyde at the time, and there was a significant exchange of gifts with the art gallery in Glasgow receiving lacquer work, porcelain, textiles and print. So he would have been au fait with Japanese art, though unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, who did go to Tokyo, Mackintosh never did. So this helps to explain why Mackintosh's style is so different. It's very Japanese in its outlook. It's minimalist, it's controlled. There are plenty of curved lines, but they are within a very obvious geometric outline, or ruled by a sort of cool geometric linear formula. So I'm showing you here the Mackintosh house as it's being reconstructed in the Hunterian Art Gallery. To show you what I mean, he was not the inventor of the White Room. I'm afraid we have to attribute that to Whistler and Godwin, but he certainly develops the White Room. And this, of course, was a combination of studio. You're in the studio area here of what was in fact their living room in Hill Head, which is where the Mackintosh house can be found. It was demolished, unfortunately, but then rebuilt within the Hunterian. So Mackintosh's style does evolve very quickly, and this is because he was very well aware of what was going on throughout Europe. And he starts off being quite Art Nouveau, in other words, very much influenced by the French, with floral forms. The important thing about Art Nouveau was, particularly in France, it looked towards the organic, so plants and flower forms. So this is the domino table for Argyle Street, 1898. And you can see that it looks like little petals, though the legs are rather weird, aren't they? They look almost like they are more like propellers. And then for Ingram Street on the other side, by about 1907, 1909, he'd moved to a sort of almost purely geometric language. And they very much like using four squares, as you can see here, the group of four squares to represent the Glasgow Four. And they were always trying to do a bit of a Leonardo to square the circle. So if you're into mathematics, I think you'd quite enjoy the way that Mackintosh plays around with geometric forms, but particularly the circle and the square. He would have read William Lethaby's incredibly influential Architecture, Mysticism and Myth. And it confuses people immensely when I say that Mackintosh was a symbolist, because we think of symbolism in poetry and in painting, but not in architecture. But once you realize that Mackintosh, like Horta, is developing a symbolist architectural language, it makes it easier for you to understand why he was so keen on ornamentation. When Mackintosh was rediscovered and made a sort of hero of modernism, they didn't like the way he was wedded to decoration. But really that misses the entire point, because Mackintosh's decoration is not decoration. It's embedded in his entire vision of making buildings meaningful, making them literally speak to you. And he does this really by learning the sort of like vocabulary of architecture going back to primitive forms. So Lethaby's idea was that buildings tend to follow a pattern, often ruled by religious beliefs, circles, squares, and this is a ziggurat pyramid on the frontispiece of architecture, mysticism, and myth. We know that Mackintosh read this. He even paraphrased it for a lecture that he gave, and we know that he had read it as early as 1893. And the library entrance, as you can see, of the Glasgow School of Art uses the ziggurat form, which, as you might imagine, is literally one steps to heaven. So he was looking for a personal language, but also a language that spoke to others. And we're going to find the ziggurat element becomes more and more important as his design ethos develops. So this is 78 Derngate. You'll see it right at the end, and you can see it's using the ziggurat form here round the front door. So they were the Glasgow Four, so inevitably the square was going to become very meaningful for them. These squares were originally all embedded around the Glasgow School of Art, and also the colours are important. He would have known and read about the use of symbolic colour, where blue is always the colour of the sky, a yellow is always the colour of heaven, it's literally God's colour, and red is always the colour of Christ's martyrdom. Yes, you're looking at the, of course, the spectrum. And if you're wondering what a Mondrian is about, that helps to explain it, because again, Mondrian imbued all of his colours with the same esoteric symbolism. And when this is one of the sheets, in fact, or one of the chapters, I should say, from Lethaby's book, again emphasising the concept of four square. So Mackintosh will really develop the square as his personal logo. It will also stand for the Glasgow Four, and by the time he gets embroiled with the Viennese, it's going to become the grid pattern. So you can see from this that Mackintosh is not an easy architect to understand. That may also explain why his career was relatively short. We think he might have been dyslexic. There have been some discussions that he was bipolar. I think we can rule out the fact that he was an alcoholic, though if he did take to the bottle, it would have been relatively late in his career. But certainly when he leaves Glasgow just before the First World War, he is to all intents and purposes a broken man, largely because he feels that his talent has never been recognised. It all starts off so very differently in the mid-1890s, studying during the evening at the Glasgow School of Art and articled to the famous architectural practice of Honeyman and Keppie. So here we have Mackintosh, down below we have Margaret, again in front of that cabinet. We have her sister Frances, and this is Herbert McNair down the bottom, who's often sort of seen as a bit of a baddie in our story. He certainly took to the bottle, and I'm afraid his marriage to Frances was not a very happy or stable one. So they make up the Glasgow Four. The two boys were blue collar. There was no artistic background in Mackintosh's family. But the two girls, the two Macdonald girls, middle class, they were sort of typical of the generation of women who wanted to break out of the mould and who were attending the Glasgow School of Art during the day. It was Friar Newbury, who was the head of the School of Art, who realised the potential of putting the two boys and the two girls together, realising that they shared a similar progressive outlook. The photograph at the top shows you them as a group known as the Immortals, gives you some idea of how sort of youthful enthusiasm and sort of like precociousness dominates. And I particularly want you to notice the young lady at the back, who is Catherine Cameron, who's holding her hands out like a protective bird over the group. This is Frances, this is Margaret, this is McNair, and this is Mackintosh. And this is John Keppie on the corner here, as in Honeyman and Keppie. So Mackintosh's breakthrough comes with the School of Art, that's 1897, but I'm just using this slide again to emphasize the symbolism. So if we look here at the front of the building, the big windows, of course, are necessary because it is a school of art and you want big north-facing windows. But these are braces to try and strengthen the window. These are stylized flowers, and these 4 square represent the earth. So in this language that he developed, squares always represent earth. Circles always represent spirit, and the ziggurat always represents our aspiration to the highest. Along the fronts of the School of Art, all these strange symbols. They're taken from Japanese mon, which is a heraldic device. And the one that you're looking at here is an ant. And the idea is that the School of Art is a place of work. You are an art worker. You go in, a normal person, and you come out transformed into an artist. And a lot of the symbolism in the building sort of underpins that idea that you go in a little seedling and you come out a fully fledged flower. Even the shadows here are emphasizing the grid pattern. So he likes patterns of usually odd numbers. So you can see here the grid is made up of 5, but he'll also use grids of 9. And the grid sort of comes to represent really, I think, Mackintosh's framework for his entire architectural style. The grid will also be taken up by the Viennese. So we can see how there's a synergy between his designs. This is one of his famous designs for a poster, the Scottish Musical Review. You can see those strange trees here at the top. They relate to the trees in front of the School of Art, Japanese heraldic devices, and the strange spooky ladies, as you can see here, of course, gave them their nickname, the Spook School. And here's an array of spooky ladies. And by the way, that poster was one of 3 that would be sent to Paris to be shown in the opening exhibition of the Maison La Nouveau, the famous gallery opened by Samuel or Siegfried Bing in Paris, from which Art Nouveau takes its name. So in the mid-1890s, Mackintosh was already very much part of the European avant-garde. So here are all my spooky ladies. So this is the panel on the front of the cabinet, which is usually attributed to Margaret, as is the panel on the right-hand side, that for those of you who are thinking that's a little weird looking, the answer is it is. That is supposed to be a sort of ionic symbolism. So this is supposed to be a womb shape with the woman in the center. And these are like fallopian tubes. Yes, I'm sorry, this is before your coffee break, with like babies as earrings to either side. And they were very fond of this ionic, it's like phallic, but for women symbolism, to represent the concept of creativity. Mackintosh down the bottom here, this is on a clothes press. His women are even more skeletal, as you can see. So one of the things that are fascinating, this is McNair down the bottom, also going in for sort of ionic symbolism. And there's that bird, as you can see, in a protective manner, is that there's often this idea that Margaret and Francis are pioneers of feminist art. But you must remember that the lads are also engaging in a very similar iconography, using the female body, not in a sexual way per se, but to represent the concept of creativity and of knowledge. So like Eve, she's sort of somewhere between an Eve and a virgin figure, seen here again as a tree of knowledge. You can see that there's a woman in there. There are apples in the tree, and we have the 2 children down the bottom, and this obviously is a book plate. So knowledge here, very obvious. But there's a very clear synergy between all their work in the mid-1890s. They'd all seen Beardsley. His work was easy to see, not only in published books, but in magazines like The Studio. And these 3 posters, so here is the Mackintosh poster, they're all going to go off to Samuel Bing's gallery La Nouveau, and then they're going to be shown in London at the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society in 1896, where they go down like a ton of bricks. This is the famous image of John the Baptist and a Salome from Oscar Wilde and Beardsley's joint project of 1894. And the poster for the Glasgow Institute of Fine Arts has Margaret as the model for the Beardsley-esque lady in the centre, again holding a stylized tree. And if anything, the girls at work is more radical. Please note how they sign in the Japanese manner, vertically. But here you've got McNair, Mackintosh and Francis working together, because I really want to emphasise what a collaboration. They really were the Glasgow Four, though we tend to lionise Mackintosh, because that's the way that history tends to work. So again, you can see some Ionic symbolism going on here. She's a sort of earth goddess with her flower, and there's a sort of strange quasi-religious figure above her, appears to be crucified, though please note it's a woman with her long hair and those stylized birds. So a lot of people didn't understand the posters, and when they did, they didn't like them. The girls' art is always a challenge. So The Pond by Francis Macdonald is supposed to be the pond in stasis. The little tadpoles are supposed to be like sperm, and the idea is that the pond is waiting to be reborn in the spring. Yes, I know you're thinking to yourself, this is all a bit weird, and you're not wrong. And Margaret's stained glass design is perhaps easier to understand, with the sort of earth goddess being kissed by Apollo, the sun, you know, to usher in the summer. Spooky ladies. They're not sexy ladies, are they? They're always skin and skeletal. And the reason that they're so weird is that, again, the girls would have been fully aware of artists like Edvard Munch. We forget that the Madonna that you're seeing here with the fetus and the sperm flying around. Sorry, I don't expect you expecting to take this on first thing in the morning, but there's like sperm flying around the outside of the Madonna. This was all would have been known to the girls through publications. This is as early, the Munch is as early as 1893. The Glasgow Rose. Now this is again a very potent feminine symbol, but it's used by both the girls, but also by Mackintosh. So at the top in Gesso, this type of plasterwork, the heart of the rose is by Margaret. The design for a cushion, believe it or not, at least what we're always told, is by Francis, and it's called the Spirit of the Rose. But this is Mackintosh's rose up here. I love this design, which was actually for a banner for the Willow Tea Rooms. This is his stained glass panel for the Rose Boudoir, and one of his almost Art Deco, I think you'd call it Art Deco wallpapers from 1923. So again, they all use the rose. Again, it's the potent symbolism of the rose. So I've done a bit of a cheat here, because it's really hard to get a decent picture of this Jan Turrup masterpiece called The Three Brides. This is the whole painting down the bottom, but I've got close-ups of the nun, the bride, and then the wicked witch femme fatale at the end, because this is how they thought of us. We were either good or bad, and the bride is somewhere in the middle, but most importantly, she's completely surrounded by roses, which, thanks to the Virgin, again becomes a very potent symbol of love and femininity. Obviously, it's also very much associated with Venus. But can you see here, these are thorns down the bottom. In my lower section, my close-ups, you can see that these are rose thorns. The crown of thorns with which Christ was crucified was a crown of rose thorns. Look at all their hair, which is coming out of the bells. And what people don't realise about the Three Brides is it's again quasi, well, it's sort of, I wouldn't say religious, that's not the right word, but it has a mysticism to it, because you can just see the nailed crucified hand of Christ above the bell. So all of them are really into this sort of symbolic mysticism. So this is something to keep at the back of your mind all the time. So Mackintosh's first two projects are quite conventional. The Queen's Cross Church would have been inspired by churches he would have seen on a sketching expedition to Porlock and Dorset. And then the Glasgow Herald building, where he's really working for Honeyman and Keppie, shows you that at this stage, the ornament might be in the new art style, but he's essentially working in a sort of conventional architectural idiom. But then he gets a commission from Miss Cranston, who was one of his most loyal, in fact, clients. And I put a bit more in about Miss Cranston for Alastair. You can ask me about that later. So Mackintosh was originally here the junior partner with George Walton, who is by far and away the most established decorator in Glasgow at the end of the 1890s. So they had to share these commissions between them for Buchanan Street and Argyle Street. So Mackintosh designed the furniture for Argyle Street. This is one of George Walton's interiors, a billiard room, just to show you that he was also very influenced by medievalism and the arts and crafts movements. So the famous chair with the bird flying through the back and the petal-like domino table were for Argyle Street, but for Buchanan Street, Mackintosh was commissioned to produce the murals. They were based on this prototype called Part Seen, Imagined Part. Again, we've got Margaret as the model in a Beardsley-esque sort of concoction of plants. It's a rose, again, femininity, but also it's emblematic again of birth, the heart of the rose, the womb. And I've always wondered what these are bobbing above. This is a moon, and I've always thought these little elements at the top were stylized flowers. So the idea is that she's become a femme fleur, and these are all flowers blooming right at the top. This, as I say, Miss Cranston, she's a real character. She was already a very successful businesswoman. She opened her first tea room as early as 1878. She was part of the temperance movement, but it went beyond that. She wanted her cafes to attract women. They were to be fashionable, stand out. Even though she marries in 1892, a Major Cochrane, in fact, she always remains Miss Catherine Cranston. It never did to make more money than your husband. We know that Lutyens went to visit Buchanan Street because the breakfasts, by the way, were very good in 1898 and found it, to quote, just a little outre. I do love that description. And until 1900, as I say, he had to work with George Walton, but after 1900, she put all of her eggs into the Mackintosh basket. In 1902, she commissioned Mackintosh to redecorate her home, House Hill, Knits Hill. Unfortunately, the house doesn't survive anymore, and it wasn't a Mackintosh house, it was only a refurbishment of the interior, but elements of the furniture do pop up. So the chair is in Richmond, Virginia, and the washstands is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And again, the interiors were well known through illustrations like the one that you see here of the four-poster beds and the chairs in magazines like The Studio. So the reason for the rose in Buchanan Street, you can perhaps see the roses now more clearly, and we've now got like a sort of paradise, an Elysian field with a tree of knowledge in the centre. George Walton did all the furniture, so that's Mackintosh. But this was a very clever pun on tea roses. And tea roses get their name from China, obviously, because they smell of tea. So that was the reason for the roses in the Buchanan Street mural. But I get the impression that anybody sitting there having a cup of tea and looking at the mural was wondering what the blinking hell was going on it, because it's not easy to understand. Before you shout at me, ah yes, but he's clearly seen Gustav Klimt, that comes later. Klimt has yet to break away. That's not till 1897, and the Secession building is 1898. So if anybody's following anybody, it's Klimt following Mackintosh and not the other way around. Anyway, I interpret this as a sort of paradise, a garden of paradise with stylized women who are in essence an embodiment of nature and rejuvenation. Following on from that project, he gets his first really big commission, which is to build the new Glasgow School of Art. We have to say at this point that nepotism probably did come into it a little bit because he was very much Francis Newbery, that's the head of the Glasgow School of Art, very much his favourite. The building, I don't know what will ever happen to it. It is just a shell after the second fire. It makes one just weep, but what can one do? But it is very important because it shows you young Mackintosh, 97 to 99, and mature Mackintosh after he's been to Vienna and to Turin, 1902 to 1909. It also is a building that grows. So in the first phase, they only got to here, to the main entrance, and then they ran out of money. And so the second element, which it takes in the library, is all from 1907 to 1909. And the first section looks very much like a castle. Again, thanks to Letherby, he would have studied Scottish vernacular architecture. That's Castle Crathays you're looking at there, but there were a whole, many Scottish castles that he could look at. And again, the idea was that you adapted the vernacular because you wanted to create a style that was nationalistic. So there's a huge upswell of nationalistic fervour at the end of the 19th century in Glasgow. Again, the sort of Celtic elements was a way in which they could assert their individual identity over the English. So this accounts for the tower and the parapet. And this is Francis Newbery's office. He could watch all the students coming in and out. And the doorway itself is protected by two ladies, stylized ladies, the genii of the place, protecting the students. It's like a temple that you're going into, a stylized rose tree in the center. Yes, don't this look like, it looks like a helicopter. It's not, it's a light fitting. I like that idea. It's square, obviously. The tree element is really important because right at the top of the building, you'll find a tree with a bird in it. Again, Letherby talks a lot about the sort of bird of the heavens. But most importantly, the patron saint of Glasgow is St Mungo, and his symbol, his attribute, is a bird in a tree. So a bit of nationalism again coming in there. The solar bird, however, was very important. He has his own calligraphy, so please note the arts and the school with the 3 bars on the A and the 3 bars on the H, and the grid pattern. So we've got a grid here of 4 by 4 by 4. So he is obsessed with the whole idea of the square and the grid. The heart of the building was known as the museum. It had all the plaster casts, sketches. Of course, none of this exists anymore, sorry. But I want you to notice the roof structure, which again could be described as vernacular. But you can see here little hearts in the rafters because that represents the heart of the building. Now, the library end, of course, was his masterpiece. Many people say that it was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright, except again, we don't think that Mackintosh had seen any work by Frank Lloyd Wright till about 1910. So this has got this vertiginous facade. There's the entrance with the ziggurat motif that again is like entering a temple, but you've got these amazing triple height windows, which again look very Frank Lloyd Wright, don't they, in their geometry. And the reason why the fire was so disastrous was it went up these internal bay windows. So I don't know if you've noticed, these go the whole height, I'm afraid, of the library, and they acted like flues in the fire. So that section of the building didn't stand a chance. This is what the library looked like prior to the disastrous fire. Looks like abacuses, doesn't it, hanging? These always remind me of like abacuses hanging from the balcony, split level mezzanine. But we can get some idea because the oak room from the Ingram Street Tea Room, which has just been reconstructed after many years in the new V&A at Dundee, is almost like him sort of working out the library. It's sort of like a precursor. So you can see a similar arrangement here, though the tails of these uprights don't drop down quite as much as they do, as you can see here in the library. But you can see that in the oak room, he was definitely sort of like planning in his mind what he was going to do with the library in the Glasgow School of Art. However, I think it's the domestic interior that really Mackintosh is the sort of master, the Gesamtkunstwerk, and he was often working with, you know, limitations. So he never had the money to build his own purpose-designed house and interior. unlike Vanderbilt and Victor Horta. He had to adapt spaces. So initially, this is the drawing room of 120 Main Street, where he and Margaret lived when they first got married. Francis and McNair marry in 1899 and Mackintosh and Margaret in 1900. So that cabinet sort of moves around the interiors, and you can see pieces of furniture which were designed for Argyle Street. And then they moved out to Hillhead, hope I've got that right, on the outskirts of Glasgow. What's the outskirts? I mean, it's literally a suburb of Glasgow, but the air was certainly cleaner, and they were still having to adapt. So it wasn't a purpose-built house. It was just the end of a standard Victorian terrace. He was able to do some adaptations, like he removed the wall here between what is in this area here in the front, in the foreground, is the drawing room, and the area behind is allegedly the studio. Though if you've ever been to an artist's studio, the idea that you would work in an interior that had a white carpet, I'm not too sure. Anyway, it's absolutely perfect, isn't it? Though you'll be pleased to know that the Mackintoshes never had any children, and it's probably just as well, because it would ruin the harmony of the interior. They did have 2 cats who were artistically arranged on the cushions to either side. We know that he owned his own Japanese prints, and you can get an idea here of what I mean about Japanese minimalism, these cool white interiors. As I said, he is not the originator of the cool white interior, which in dirty old Glasgow at the end of the 19th century would have been a challenge to keep clean. The electric light, of course, helped. The cabinet, which is magnificent. Can you see the cabinet just here? This is what it's based on. It was originally designed for another client, and this I actually photographed in Toronto. It was part of Professor Howard's collection. So he gave all of his Mackintosh pieces to his home country, Canada. So yes, you have to go a long way to track down Mackintosh. Aren't the 2 stylized ladies holding their roses beautiful? We also know that Mackintosh collected blue and white, didn't they all? So again, it's always important to remember the influence of Japan and China on Mackintosh's architecture. He would also have been influenced by C.F.A. Voysey, who was England's most progressive arts and crafts architect. So I'm showing you Voysey's immaculate interior of the orchard at Chorley Wood. Again, it has a sort of, it's very understated. It looks a bit severe, doesn't it? So let me give you some colour. We know the walls were purple. We know the carpets were colourful green colour, and that the curtains were bright red. So it wouldn't be quite as drab as it appears in my photograph. And the sort of linearity, as you can see here, of the enclosing of the staircase, and the sort of general sort of Voysey-esque, again, sort of minimalism would have been very influential on Mackintosh. So Voysey is sometimes, C.F.A. Voysey is sometimes rather cruelly, I think, referred to as England's Mackintosh. And I've mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright several times, so here's a comparison. So this is the Ward Willets house of 1901 to 1903. You can see that Mackintosh is quite ephemeral by comparison. That Frank Lloyd Wright perhaps sits better within the arts and crafts milieu, solid oak furniture. You could invite a Viking, couldn't you, to join you around that dining table. But you can see a very obvious synergy between their love of the straight line as opposed to the curved line. In the case of Frank Lloyd Wright, it was because he was raised on the principles of kindergarten. Right, so back in the Mackintosh house, you can see that by comparison, it's much more sort of feminine and delicate. So here I've lined up the chairs for you. A Voysey chair, they all, by the way, they all had to design one tall-backed chair. The Voysey one is very distinctive. It's got 2 hearts in the back, as it was commissioned by a newly married couple. And then the Argyle Street chair in the middle with the bird flying through the ellipse, and then the deck chair by Frank Lloyd Wright at the end. It's like a wooden deck chair, isn't it? But it's fun just to line them all up, I think. Anyway, upstairs in the Mackintosh house, we've got this exquisite bedroom. There's that amazing beaten pewter panel over the fireplace by Margaret. She might also have done the stenciling, as you can see, on the linen of the bed. But please note the mirror, because here it is in situ. At the end of 1900, Mackintosh was invited to the 8th Vienna Secession exhibition. We know that he was in Vienna with Margaret for about 5 weeks. Unfortunately, the McNairs couldn't attend because Frances was pregnant. So it was very much a Mackintosh show. He was immensely successful. They sort of flocked around him. There's all sorts of wonderful stories about them raising him up onto his shoulders and carrying him through the streets of Vienna as a sort of hero of modern design. I think some of that is sort of like mythology. But the important thing is that Mackintosh was given due recognition for his and Margaret's collaboration. So Margaret supplied the May Queen. That will end up in Ingram Street in a tea room. And you can see here the mirror on display alongside an Argyle Street chair, and the banners. Here's a banner designed by Margaret. So this is a classic example of a prophet unloved in his own land. So when he got to Vienna, he was talk of the town alongside Margaret, to be fair. And this is the building in which it was shown, the famous Secession building of 1898, with the declaration, to every age its art, to art its freedom. And Mackintosh had an immediate impact on the evolution of the Vienna Secession, particularly through the architect Joseph Hoffmann. And it will be Hoffmann and Kolo Moser who found the Wiener Werkstätte in 1903. Now you can see here these interiors by Hoffmann of 1900 to 1901. And if I hadn't told you they were Hoffmann, you might have thought they were Mackintosh. The giveaway is that this interior, of course, framed a magnificent portrait of Madame Henberg by Gustav Klimt. We also know that Mackintosh was feted when he went to Turin in 1902. This was the high point of Art Nouveau. People always say it's Paris 1900, but it was really Turin 1902. This is the pavilion by Raimondo Aronco. And the Germans excelled, the Scots excelled, but so did Italian liberty. So we've got the entrance here to the Scottish section, but above I've got some furniture by Carlo Bugatti to exemplify the eccentricity of Italian liberty style. That's what they know it as there. It's not Art Nouveau, it's liberty style. Mackintosh caused a sensation with this interior, the white rose and the red rose, or the rose boudoir. This is how it was shown in the studio. And this is the gesso or gesso panel designed by Margaret, which has got these two intertwined women and stylized roses. If you want to ask me more about those at the end, you can. And Margaret, we can't make the supposition that she was always responsible for the decorative elements. The stencil pattern that you see here on the chairs is always attributed to Mackintosh himself, but the theme throughout obviously was the rose. Fritz Warndorfer, who will back the founding of the Wiener Werkstätte, was very impressed by the rose boudoir and commissioned this music room from the Mackintoshes, so that's Margaret and Charles, for his home in Vienna. It was quite a long project. It wasn't finished until 1907. I'm going to show you the table, as it's slightly quirky, as it has 4 legs to either side, and would defy sort of any logic of the arts and crafts movement. And in this section here, which is blank, you've got to imagine this going in, the absolutely amazing frieze based on the 7 princesses, which was designed and fabricated by Margaret. You can see the 7 princesses all lined up with our sleeping princess in the center. It's a very sad story. The knight goes off to do what knights do, but in his absence, his beloved dies. Yes, typical pre-Raphaelite story. And so here's the central section of the prince and his beloved. I'm going to show you a close-up because it gives you a good idea of the complexity of these panels that Margaret worked on. So gesso is a type of fine plaster. She also used string. There are, oh, hang on, sorry, I've got somebody in the waiting room. There's also, she uses semi-precious stones. So there's all sorts of bits and bobs going on in terms of the materials that she used. So inevitably, in this last little section, I'm going a little fast, I apologise. Mackintosh was inevitably also influenced by his meeting all these great architects and designers, both in Vienna and then in Turin. In Turin, he met them all, Olbrich, Behrens, you name it, he met them. And so he came back bubbling with ideas, which were then expressed in the Willow Tea Rooms and the beautiful Hill House, which I'm going to show you. So here is the Willow Tea Room chair with a stylized tree in the back, and we have now virtually lost all the curves in favour of the square and the grid. So the Willow Tea Rooms is his tour de force, as he was actually able to design the entire Gesamtkunstwerk. It reopened in 2018 after a major restoration programme. Again, it has a very obvious symbolic programme. It's called the Willow Tea Rooms because that's what Socky Hall means. It means alley or meadow of willows, and willow pattern was used throughout the cafe. On the walls in plasterwork, again, were allegedly stylized willow trees of the type that you're seeing here at the top. And we've got lots of original photographs of how it looked, which aided and abetted the restoration. This is how it looks today. You will still eat off of willow pattern. However, it's the mezzanine area that usually people are bowled over by, sort of somewhere between arts and crafts in Japan, as you can see. And even more elaborate is the so-called room deluxe, where you had to pay a little extra. I think it was as much as sixpence extra to dine in the room deluxe on aluminium coated chairs with stained glass panels in the back, well, glass panels in the back, and then these amazing mirrors. It's just like a palace, as you can see, but in miniature, because it's quite a small space. And Margaret contributes her gesso panel. It's now in the Kelvin Grove. O ye that walk in the willow wood, courtesy of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. So you can see some obvious pre-Raphaelite elements coming in. In terms of leaded glass, the doorway at the Willow Tea Room is Mackintosh's masterpiece in that idiom, as is the panel, continuous panel of mirror and glass going round as a frieze. So Hill House is equally beautiful and shares many design elements. As you can see here, this is the winter area around the fireplace. And above the fireplace, another gesso panel, the Sleeping Princess, very much like the one in Vienna for Fritz Warndorfer, surrounded by roses. Wonderful mosaic around the fireplace. And this is you can see here the recent restoration, how those are Margaret's antimacassars that have been reconstructed. It was very beautifully stenciled, as you can see. And this is the so-called summer area, and there's an area for the piano. So each area within the room had a very obvious function. So this was almost like a conservatory. The table is very famous. If you're lucky enough to be there on a summer's day, it acts almost like a sundial, because as the light shines through the grid pattern, it moves across the floor. Margaret would have been responsible for much of the soft furnishings at Hill House. Then out into the hallway with the famous clock. Again, if we had more time, I'd talk about the function of the house, as Mackintosh watched the Blackies and how they lived and tried to tailor a house to their needs. It's close to Frank Lloyd Wright's linearity. This is his masterpiece of just a few years later, the Roby House in Chicago, where again you have the same linearity. You're looking here at the dining room at the bottom, which in the top images are the drawing room, but really it's just one big giant space. Mackintosh does not think vertically. That's the trick of Victor Horta. So this is Horta's house and museum. This was his own home and studio, and you can see it plays with spaces much more overtly. So you have a mezzanine, you have this magnificent staircase that goes right the way up to the center of the house, and the famous confronting mirrors at the top that make Art Nouveau look as though the line is infinite. So Mackintosh was very much driven always by his Japanese ethos. So he's thinking linearly. He will divide a space up by function. So in the bedroom, you have the sleeping area. Then you have the dressing area. And so I'm showing you here the dressing area with the wardrobes. I'm just going to give you a pop-up of that chair, because of course it's totally impractical. You can't move it away from the wall. You can't really sit on it. Well, not in any sense of being comfortable. It's really more an object that looks like a chair. It's there to make a grid pattern, obviously. And looking behind me, as it were, is this little cozy ingle nook by the fireplace. So each portion of the room had a designated function. And the even more sort of like perfect design for his house for an art lover obviously leans very heavily on the Hill House project for Walter Blackie, who of course made his money from publishing. So here's the exterior as it looks at the moment. It's completely covered with this massive scaffolding. This was designed to protect the rough cast. The water's getting in between the rough cast and the core, and it's in a real terrible state. So the answer was to cover, like a modern art installation, the entire building, as you can see, in a plastic skeletal framework. And I was talking about how he watched how the Blackies lived. So it's rather amusing that that is the principal bedroom and that's the nursery. You couldn't get farther apart, could you, in a building if you tried. I've always rather liked that idea. Just to show you how advanced Mackintosh's vision was, you only have to compare it to the wonderfully named Mackay Hugh Bailey Scott, one of England's premier arts and crafts architects. You can see that his exterior of the beautiful Blackwell, which is an arts and crafts museum now on at Bowness on Lake Windermere, it looks like a giant Cotswold manor house. And inside it has a lovely white room, but this predates Mackintosh. This is 1897-98 in date. And although this looks quite advanced, the entrance, as you can see, is really sort of very medieval in its use of half timbering and the big ingle-nook fireplace. And Mackintosh has moved away from all of these historic quotations. But I want you to sort of compare Bailey Scott's vision of modernity, because this is his submission for a house for an art lover. So this is the famous competition that Mackintosh entered in 1901. He didn't win it because his submission was inaccurate. There was an error. But the important thing is that the portfolio of drawings for the house for an art lover have survived. So this was his rival. This is Bailey Scott's medieval vision of a house beautiful, rather pre-Raphaelite, I think you'll agree. And this is the completely different image. It's much more, daring interior by Mackintosh. And this provided the basis for building a house that never existed in Bellahouston Park in Glasgow. So here's the exterior. I do love these, again, women, the sort of spirits of the house, 4 of them, of course, with the stylized tree in the center. And it's used for weddings now. It's owned by the University of Glasgow. So this is the music room element. So we're looking here in one direction. I do like the built-in cabinets to either side. I'm not sure they're deep enough to hold anything. But even more amazing is the piano or the organ at the other end. I just love the stylized women with their aluminium moons behind them. Sort of pure Mackintosh, these skeletal ladies. We know that Margaret designed the gesso panels for the dining room, which you see here. This is high Art Nouveau, as you can see, in 1901 in Darmstadt. But in fact, Mackintosh was already sort of moving away from that elaborate, rather feminine style. You can see something chunkier here at Scotland Street School, which he built between 1904 and 1906. And obviously he was still working for Miss Cranston. Ingram Street was still undergoing transformation. So dating to the same era as the library at the School of Art, we have the Chinese room here of 1911, and the famous barrel chair was also designed for Ingram Street. This again, the lower image is a modern reconstruction of it. So none of the original interiors or building of Ingram Street survived. It was turned into a shoe shop in the 1970s. To come to the end of my story, as I realise I'm running late, by 1910, you can see a definite decline in Mackintosh's mental state. The promise of those years, particularly Vienna and Turin, just seem to have eluded him. There were not enough clients, and there certainly weren't enough brave clients in Glasgow. And then there was the huge blow of submitting to the competition to build the cathedral in Liverpool. You can see his submission here, and of course he fails. It'll go to Giles Gilbert Scott. And at this point, a broken Mackintosh leaves Glasgow forever, is recommended to go to Walberswick, which was already something of an artistic enclave. He'd been there before, and so he's returning to somewhere he knows quite well. This interlude is very famous, the play Mackie or Mac, with played, I'm trying to think who may have played the part, I apologise. But importantly, the upshot of all of this is the locals become very suspicious of Mackintosh's thick Glasgow accent, and even more so because he's getting lots of letters from his friends in Austria. We are now at war, and he's actually arrested and accused of being a spy or a collaborator. Tom Conte played him in the play, which you might try to seek out. So they then decide to settle in Chelsea. I'm going to finish with those images in just a minute, but we have Mackintosh's last big project for Bassett Loke, who was a manufacturer of models. Please, when you go to visit 78 Derngate, don't call them toys. They are models, trains and ships. And Bassett Loke was at the forefront of progressive design. He'll become a member of the DIA, Design and Industries Association. He's going to get married. He needs a new marital home. This is Derngate. It's tiny. It's this little section that I'm pointing out here with my cursor, with the black Mackintosh door and the new bay window, which by the way isn't by Mackintosh, it's by a precursor. And Bassett Loke is limited, obviously, because we're in the war years. This is the original door, by the way, which is now safely stored away. It's a reproduction on the front, and the famous light fitting above with 78 Derngate on it. And just to sort of conclude, he's gone back to his ziggurat, as you can see here, around the fireplace, around the front door, and obviously it's picking up on the ziggurat entrance of the library section of the School of Art. And you can understand why Mrs. Bassett Loke didn't like it. Rather fortuitously, Mr. Bassett Loke was colourblind. Yeah, and she insists that the pattern is changed from black, which is very intense in such a small space. So the lower image here is showing you what she favoured, which is pale grey, but with an equally, I think you'll agree, bold frieze running round the top. And yes, it's stylised trees, in case you're wondering what you're looking at. This is the little tobacco cabinet. That's a copy of it that they've made for the house. The original is in the V&A. And the infamous clock made out of aeronoid, which is a type of Irish plastic. It's a sort of, it's like celluloid, but using milk from Ireland. So it was called aeronoid. Yes, I know, it's very bizarre. But this again shows you how Mackintosh wanted to experiment with new modern materials, and the clock dates to 1919. So this is the famous screen, taking us up, basically hiding the staircase, up to the bedroom where George Bernard Shaw, who was a friend and colleague of Bassett Loke, came to visit, and Mrs. Bassett Loke was worried that he wouldn't be able to cope with the bedroom. But fortunately, Bernard Shaw simply replied, "Don't worry, Mrs. Bassett-Loke, I sleep with my eyes shut." So perhaps he wasn't sort of given a headache by the black and white lines of the tester that went above his head. In fact, they're blue and white, dark blue rather than black. And the famous domino clock also dates to about 1919, and may well have been for that interior. So we're coming to the end of our story. He gets one last commission from Miss Cranston. As the dugout, of course, was a sort of an homage to the trenches of the First World War. And you can see now these bold colours, yellow and blue and geometric forms. During his Chelsea years, only one commission comes to fruition. This is it on Glebe Place, incredibly modern, modest and much altered. This is nothing like Mackintosh conceived. And they made a frugal living at this point from designing for wallpapers and textiles. Tulips here dates to about 1923 at 25. And then they decide to go to France. Margaret comes into a small annuity, a small amount of money. They've both got very poor health. They head to Callure, which was like a spa town. And Mackintosh was planning a one-man show of his flower drawings from Walberswick and his images of Port Vendre and Callure. But unfortunately, he's diagnosed with cancer, not of the liver. I don't think he was an alcoholic, but he smoked very heavily, particularly French cigarettes. He dies in effect of cancer of the tongue and throat. That's in 1928. Margaret outlives him by just a few years. She dies in 1933. And when she dies, the entire contents of her flat, all those beautiful watercolors, the flowers and the landscapes and all the furniture that they'd kept, the whole lot is only valued at £80 in 1933. And of course, the upshot of that is that Mackintosh had got left behind. Design had moved on. This is the first so-called modern building in Europe. It's the Postal Savings Bank in Vienna by Otto Wagner of 1904 to 1907. And I suppose you could argue that Mackintosh should have gone to Vienna or to Berlin or anywhere other than Glasgow to basically get the clients that he needed. He did not leave a legacy. There is no architect that follows in his footsteps, unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, who created an entire school. But if it hadn't been for Mackintosh, we might well have not had the Bauhaus. So I'm showing you to conclude the Wassily Kandinsky chair, which is by Marcel Brouwer. And on the other side, the equally famous Mies van der Rohe Barcelona chair. So Mackintosh has now become part of this great pantheon, the sort of precursors of modernism. And he's recognized now as a giant of 20th century architecture and design. But sadly, he did not get that recognition at the end of his life. Though to be fair, neither did Voysey, who is my personal hero of the new art era. So I leave you at last with my last slide, and I do apologize. You can find out more about me on my website, which is anne-anderson.com. You've probably gathered that I know too much about Art Nouveau, and I can prove that because it's my most recent book. This is the cover. You'll find it on Amazon, and it's quite affordable. And if you've liked what I have offered you, I have a lecture series starting on Wednesday, the 10th of February at 11 o'clock. If you want to find out more about my lecture series and my free charity lectures, then please just go to my website, anne-anderson.com. Thank you for your patience.